Hi guys, welcome to my first series of videos for my project Personal Relationship as a Service. So my primary objective is to apply data within a fully dynamic and interchangeable construct, and then distill this into personal relationship as a service. So the service itself becomes a marketing product, a marketing tool by which you can create and execute data-driven marketing campaigns. Throughout the videos, I'm going to avoid the word personalisation as much as I possibly can, since this represents a very widely used but a very basic and a very crude concept in current database marketing. At the core of the objective really is the statement, I'm interested in having a personal relationship with you. So me, the brand, is interested in having a personal relationship with you, the customer. This goes way beyond the scope of standard personalization. For this exercise, the construct is going to take the form of a customer targeted retail sales e-zine. Now throughout the videos, whenever I'm referring to coding or doing coding, I'm going to be talking a lot about elegance. That's going to be a major part of the video. It's really an endeavor to create efficient coding derived from elegant aesthetics. So the definition of elegance is really a scientific and mathematical one, which really talks about precision and accuracy. And the more elegance that you have in your coding, the more efficient it is, the faster it is, the more scalable it is. So really speaking, it's best practice to always code with elegance in mind. It makes your coding scalable and adaptable to much larger uses and much larger projects than maybe you envisage at the start. So it's good to get that right at the beginning. The development languages, platforms and applications that we're going to be talking about and using are, it's PHP MySQL based. The main code editor is Eclipse. I'm also going to be using Adobe Dreamweaver to put together the format of the HTML for the actual e-zine. I'm going to be dipping into MySQL Workbench for any diagrammatical requirements that I might have. And I'm also going to be using Adobe Photoshop for actual creation of the e-zine content. Okay, so let's get on with part one. Okay, so for video one, we are going to establish the data sources that we're going to be using to generate the dynamic content of the customer e-zine. At this point, what I want to say is that for the next few videos, we're going to go through the process of creating that e-zine, and we're going to culminate in the creation of that dynamic personalized e-zine that we can send out to customers. But that is just the starting point, so that becomes our blank canvas, and from there we're going to explore ways in which we're actually going to start to develop those personal relationships. So we're going to move away from the straightforward personalization into forming that much deeper relationship using the data and using the insight. Okay, so first of all let's go to the Excel spreadsheet where I've been setting up some of the sample records that we're going to use. Okay, so here I've been creating some sample records. There are 5 customers who have previously done business with the store, and I'm just going to quickly run through these fields with you. So here we've got account number. These are unique account numbers for each customer that the store will have. Here we have title, Mr., Ms., Mrs., Miss, Mr. First name, followed by other names, followed by the last name. Then we've got the email, followed by date of birth, followed by the gender, and then we have 4 address fields, followed by the county field, And finally over here we have the postcode. Now this data I'm going to save this as a CSV file, which we can then import to a customer database. So let's now just take a look at the database that I've been setting up to receive this data. Now I've set up a database called TOST, that's T-O-S-T, which is for Tim's online store. And the first entity, the first table that we're going to be having in here is for the master account. And here it is. So the structure that we've got here in master account reflects that which you actually saw in the Excel spreadsheet. So here we've got an integer field for the account number, and then we've got variable character fields for title, first name, other names, last name, email, date of birth has a date field. We've got more variable character fields for gender, address 1, 2, 3 and 4, followed by county, postcode, and I've added an extra field called mailable, which we're going to use to flag up whether or not a customer is mailable or not. And there are many reasons why a customer might not be mailable. So now I could just import really directly into here from a CSV file that we've just created in Excel. But because we're basing this all on the concept of a retail store e-zine, I think we should go through the process of actually looking at how we can create and build systems using PHP to actually create a back end for the store to actually import that data. Okay, so I've set up a new PHP file called tost import new customer.php. So this is the file that we're going to use to import that data we just saw in the Excel spreadsheet. Now the first thing that I always do when I'm creating a PHP page that's going to be dealing with data and potentially large data sets, again this goes to elegance, is to think ahead and increase what is essentially your timeout, so that if you are dealing with and also trying to process large data sets, that the system won't time out, it will give you time to actually do that. So I'm just going to manually do that here in the file. I mean, this is something that you can actually change in your PHP ini file, but I usually do it this way. Okay, I'm going to change that to 600 seconds, so that's 10 minutes that it will wait before it actually times out when it's processing. I'm just going to make a little comment there. Okay, cool. The other thing that I always do, again this is something that you can do from your PHP ini, but I always like to suppress PHP notices. I mean, notices, they're not actually there as errors, they're there just to give you direction, and quite often they can actually be a little bit annoying. So I'm going to make a little comment here that I'm going to suppress the PHP notices. And I'm just going to use here error reporting. Okay. There we go. That's switched off notices. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is discuss how we're actually going to connect to our database. Now, I quite often use an include function to connect to that database and actually get those credentials. I think it's probably best practice, and I think it's actually safer to do it that way. So before we go on any further, let me just quickly do another PHP file that's actually going to create those credentials in a different location. Okay, so I have created another .php file, which contains or would contain your logon credentials. So it's called CSE underscore DB underscore connect. The CSE being for the customer ezine underscore database underscore connect. But you know, I've actually come up with that file name. Now this is actually stored in a completely different directory to that which contains the tost import new customers.php. So that gives you some added security there. It contains an array, as you can see here, under the variable CSEDB. And that array contains your host, your username and your password. Now because I'm using a local host server configuration and there's nothing actual public here, I've not actually set up a specific username or password for this particular exercise, but this is where you would put that information, which can then be included in other PHP files every time you need to make a connection to the tost database. Now if I go back to tost import new customers, I'm just actually going to put an include function in here, and this will actually connect to that file we were just looking at. So I'm going to say include. Okay, and I'm actually moving back a step in the directory structure, and I'm going to go into a new folder, CSE underscore connect slash CSE DB connect.php. So that there is the file that contains our login credentials. So that now means that every time we wish to make a connection, we can do it using the variable CSEDB, which we saw in the connect file. So that's this one here. So it's basically brought this variable into this page for use. Okay, so in terms of the next part of the connection, I always use the MySQL extension, which is the newest and most secure means of connecting to a database. So I'm going to create a new variable, MySQL, and this is where I'm going to make the connection. So that's going to be equals a new MySQL, and this is where I'm going to bring in that variable from the file the include file we were just looking at. There we go. Okay, and that's going to be the host part of the array, followed by user, followed by password. Okay, and we know that that is going to be for the tost database. Okay, so $MySQL, that's the variable that we then directly use to connect to the database. And just for those of you who might be watching who haven't used this technique again, let me just go through it for you again. So all of these here, CSEDB host, CSEDB user, CSEDB password, are from the array in this include file here, where we've got CSEDB host user password together with their values on this side. So that's how you would actually get that information into tost import new customer.php. Okay, so I think now the next thing we're going to do is look at specifically, okay, how are we going to import that CSV file? So let's come down here and we're going to start a new variable file equals, and now I'm going to put the name of the actual CSV file from the Excel spreadsheet that we were looking at earlier, and that name is called QDET, as in customer detail, export CSV dot CSV. Okay, so that is the name of the actual file. The file is saved in the same directory as this page, task import new customer PHP, so I don't need to put a file path name, I can just use the file name. Now I'm going to actually open that file to read with a new variable, so this is going to be a new customers equals file open or fopen in PHP, and I'm going to put the file name, which is now stored under the file variable, and I want to read it, so I'm going to use R to signify that I actually want to read that file. Okay, so we've now opened that file. Okay, so that file is now ready for us to read. So now it's going to be a case of how we're going to take that and we're going to actually import it line by line into the database. So record by record we're going to import it into the database. Right, so I just want to quickly talk to you about the way that we're going to actually insert the contents of the CSV file into the MySQL table that we've set up in Toast. We're going to use MySQLi, which is, it's really best practice to use that. It is the most secure way that you can actually do that. So you can see that here I've added the SQL statement, insert into master account, followed by the field names for that particular entity. So we're talking about the account number, title, first name, other names, last name, email, DOB, gender, address 1, 2, 3, 4, county, postcode, and mailable. So those are all the fields that we looked at earlier. And using the new the predefined statement that you can use for MySQLi, a prepared statement, we are using the values at the moment purely placeholders as question marks in that statement, and I'll come on a little bit later to how we actually substitute that for the actual content of the CSV file that we're going to be importing. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bit of PHP coding, which is going to read line by line the content of the CSV file. And then I'm going to go through a series of sanitizing that data and cleansing that data before we actually write it to the database. Okay, so I've added all of the PHP code that I need to insert into the database. The last bit that I'm actually doing is I'm adding something called microtime, which I always use, and it's a means by which you can actually measure the amount of time that your PHP code is taking to process. It's quite useful, again, coming back to efficiency. It's quite a useful thing to have. I mean, because we're only really using a tiny sort of data set as a sample, it doesn't really affect it. It's not really necessarily that relevant, but it's just something by habit that I now always do. Again, because obviously you're trying to build in elegance and efficiency sort of from the ground. So I do this every time. It's best practice. Okay, so I'm now going to go through the script that I've done, and I'm going to talk you through how we're actually going to read and store the CSV file into the Toast database. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a loop, and we're going to loop through that CSV file which we have opened under the file string here, which we did a little bit earlier, and we're going to literally go through it line by line in a while loop and actually take and record those lines of information into variables prior to actually storing it into the database. So here we've got the new data array, which I declared a little bit earlier on. So new data equals fgetCSV, new customers, which is what we opened here. This was new customers is the variable that we use for the fopen file to read, signifying it with ER. And we're going to read it to 1,000 characters per row. Now I know we don't exceed 1,000 characters, so that's absolutely fine. Down here, I've made the isMailable field is going to default at Y for now. And the reasons for it changing to an N for no is going to be part of the sanitizing process that we're going to go through as we clean that data up before we store it. Okay, so it's really important. We talked a little bit earlier on about the fact that the header of the data is going to be row 0 in that file. Now we don't want to store those headers, the field names, into the field names themselves. That's going to serve no purpose at all. So if on this if statement, if the variable I is greater than 0, we can continue. So essentially we're going to bypass the header row with all of those field names as we sanitize and as we store that data. Okay, so if it isn't the header, that's what that basically says, we're going to continue as follows. Okay, so one of the first things that we need to do is that we've got mandatory fields in the data that we really need, and those mandatory fields are going to be the account number, title, first name, which can be just an initial, that's fine, last name, we're not too worried about the other names, whether or not that field is used, email, date of birth, address 1, county and postcode. And now we just need to check before we continue that those mandatory fields are populated, that they're not actually empty, which is what we've got here in an if statement. So here you can see that it's taken the new data array, it's taken the first row of the CSV file, and it's now saying if new data 0 basically is null, or is, in this case is not null, so it's populated, and new data 1 is the same, is not null, is not empty. Same for new data 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 and 13, which are all of these mandatory fields that we've got here. Then we can continue. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next little bit here, and this is all about checking the next bit. We're going to sanitize and check this account number, because there were a couple of prerequisites to my store, to Tim's online store, with regards to account numbers. Firstly, all account numbers are 8 digits long, all of them. And that's the first part of this if statement here. If string length of new data 0 being the account number, does not equal 8, or if new data 0 is not numeric, which is this here, in which case it's not a valid account number. When that happens, new data 0 is going to equal 0, and we're going to come on later as to the significance of that 0. And isMailable now is changed to N. They are no longer mailable, it's no longer regarded as a valid account. The next thing that we're going to do, just to make sure, is that the account number doesn't already exist. Now, in Tim's online store, of course, we know it doesn't already exist because the process by which that data has been captured is very robust, even though I haven't actually done that. But we're going to take that for granted. But nevertheless, it's best practice to check at this point before you put it into the database. So that's what we're going to do here. And we're going to do if MySQLi error, MySQLi, which is MySQLi being, if I scroll back up, that is the variable that we have. Where is it? It's here. This contains all of the login credentials for the database. So let me come back down. There you go. So here it's connected. If it doesn't connect, it's gonna echo, it's gonna print out to the screen that there's an error connecting to the database, and it's gonna exit at that point. If we connect, we're gonna continue, and we're gonna do this. We have a new variable called account check. Again, we're using the MySQL query statement. So I'm using all of the MySQL extensions for this project. We're going to select the title from the master account. So the master account is the table that we've set up in TOS that we're going to be putting this information into, where account number equals new data 0. So essentially it's saying select the title from the table containing the account database if it equals the account number that essentially we're going to be trying to write to the database. Limit 1, because we only need to actually select it once. We don't need more than one. Fetch object title. So now we are going to be able to check if account check does not equal nothing, if the field isn't empty, then I'm going to do another variable, ACC check here, $i equals I. Now again, don't forget that $i is the variable that we've established outside of this while loop that we're currently in. So $i is going to go through each record. So in this instance, for this particular line in that CSV file, if it is the case that that account number, for whatever reason, already exists, it's going to create I in ACC check $i array. The next bit about the sanitizing is we're going to validate that the email address is in the correct format. This is quite easy to do. We can use, there's a pre-defined function available to do this. So we're just going to say if filter variable, or if it's not filter variable, for a valid email, and you can all do this. If that isn't true, it means that the email is in a correct. It's an incorrect format, and it's not a. It's probably down to maybe a typo when the initial data entry was made. In which case, that is rendered invalid. Is mailable again is changed to N. At this point, they are no longer mailable because they do not have a valid email address. Now we're going to come on to something a little bit more complicated. We're going to look at the postcode, and we're going to look at how those postcodes are formatted, bearing in mind that that is the postcode that's going to actually end up being printed onto any packages which are being dispatched from my store. And we wanted to follow what are post office guidelines on how that postcode should visibly look. So there's certain rules, and these are the rules that we've got here on how they're formatted. So you can see that if your postcode has got 5 characters in it, 5 alphanumeric characters, this is the format it takes here. So you have the first 2 characters with a space followed by the last 3 characters. Similarly, if you've got 6 alphanumeric characters, it's going to follow this format. You've got 3 characters with a space followed by the final 3 characters, and so on. We've got it down here for an 8. Is that an 8 character? Sorry, that's a 7 character postcode, where you've got the first 4 characters with a space and then followed by the last 3 characters, and so on. You can see all of these formats actually here, and we just want to make sure that the postcode is in that correct format. If it isn't in that correct format, we're actually going to force that format upon the postcode. So what we're going to do is we are going to strip out spaces from the postcode that's in the data from the CSV file. We're just going to start from scratch. It's easier. So we're going to any spaces that are in there are going to come out, so we're just left with a string of alphanumeric characters at that point for the postcode. Okay, So now to check the postcode, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to make sure there's no special characters in there. I want to make sure there's no asterisks or exclamation marks or any what would be illegal characters for postcode. So I'm going to use the C type, alnum, which is actually going to check, it's going to check the type, and it's going to check to make sure that it's alphanumeric only. So that's now what we are going to do. So we're going to, first of all, we're going to check, is it alphanumeric only? New data 13 be in the postcode variable. And we're going to ask, is string length greater than 7? And string length less than 5? If that is the case, there are no postcodes there's no UK postcodes that are greater than 7 characters or less than 5 characters that we should be using, and that means that it would be if any of these statements here are correct. Yeah, so if it isn't alphanumeric and if it isn't of the correct length, we know it's not a proper postcode. So we know that at that point it's invalid. So at that point, new data 13, the postcode, is changed to invalid, and again is mailable, that flag is changed to N. So now we are going to move on to the next bit of the postcode cleaning, which is about actually how we format it correctly into the configurations we looked at a little bit earlier. Okay, I just took a short break there because I wanted to work out the best way to explain to you how we're going to apply the post office format to the postcode. So the easiest way is if I could just come down here, I'm just going to put a postcode in. So I don't know even if that's a real postcode, it doesn't matter at this point. Obviously we've removed any spaces, so we just get a line of alphanumeric characters. The key to this is very, very simple. The way the format works is that the last section of digits, of characters, sorry, after the space in a postcode is always 3. Everything else precedes it. So that's how, whether or not it's a 3 space 3 or whether or not it's a 4 space 3, it's always the last 3 characters come after the space. That's how the format works, and that's what we're going to do here. So if I just take a look at this line here, so the first thing I'm checking is if new data 13, the postcode, is not invalid. Don't forget that up here we would have changed it to invalid if it met any of the disqualifying conditions. If it is, then now it's going to modify it into the correct format. So I'm just going to follow this through. So new data 13, so the postcode equals, sorry, substring new data 13 0, so that's right at the beginning of the string, comma, string length, so that's the string length of new data 13, which takes us right to the end, and then here you can see we've got -3, and that puts it right there, and that, as you can see here, inserts the space. That's how this works. So it doesn't matter how many digits you've got here, whether it's 3, whether it's 4, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, because it's always going to work backwards here from the last 3 characters, and that's where it's going to insert the space. So that's how it creates the properly formatted postcode. Okay, so it's made that change to new data 13, and so basically that's cleansed, that's cleaned up that postcode, ready to actually write into the database. Okay, so now we're going to go into our final piece of cleansing, our final piece of sanitizing for the data. And we're going to start to create a new set of variables, which are going to be the ones that are going to be new variable arrays that we're then going to use to actually input and store those bits of data into the entity that we've created for the master account. So the first thing we're doing is we're going to take new data 0, which is the account number, and we're going to actually move that into a new variable called final account number $I. We're going to go then to the title, so that's Mr., Mrs., Ms., and we're going to cleanse this as well as move this into final title I, another new array that I'm creating. So in order to make sure this is in the correct format, what we need is for that title, it's going to be led by a capital character, and the rest of the characters in the title will be lowercase. So this is what I've done here, as you can see. So here we have got the whole of new data 1 is string to lower, so that's changing it all to lowercase, but we are preceding that outside the parenthesis with the UC words, so that's uppercase words. So that will make sure that we are leading with an uppercase character followed by the rest of it, which is going to be lowercase. So that will give us the correct format. We're doing exactly the name for the first name, which is now going to become final first name array. We've got final other names, again exactly the same process for changing the case. The same for final last name. Email doesn't apply, we've already cleansed email. Date of birth, again the case doesn't apply. For the gender, we want to use uppercase to lead on a lowercase word. And similarly for all of the 4 address fields that we're going to be using, again we need to be using led by uppercase with the remainder being lowercase. We're also going to use it for final county. Postcode we've already just cleansed, we don't need to change that. Is mailable, that's that single character flag of a Y or an N that we've already got, and that's created all of the arrays that we're going to be using when we actually come to storing that within the database. So now what it's done, so it's gone through the first record in that CSV file. Okay, and it stored it as whatever is the value of $I at this point in all of these arrays. Now we're going to increment I by 1, and we're going to go right back to the beginning of the loop here, and we're going to go through that whole process again for the next row of data that we're getting from the CSV file. So all in all, because we know that there are only 4 sample records in that CSV file, this is going to loop through this 4 times, adding this to the final set of arrays that we've got down here. Okay, so now we've got those variable arrays all set up, and they've all got legal content within them that we can use to store. Okay, so now we get to the exciting point. So we're going to now store this in the database. So the first thing that I've done is I've set $I to 1, $ERR, error as it were, to 1, and now we're going to go through a loop for each of those records that we've taken from the CSV file and we've stored within all of our field arrays. So here we've got while $I is less than the count of final account number, it will process the content of the loop. So this is going to loop through every single record that we've imported, and of course in this case there's only 4 from the CSV file. Now because we're using that prepared statement, I said that we were using MySQL purely as best practice. It generally helps to prevent things like sort of an SQL PHP injection. It's just I always use this now instead of the more traditional format, and this is how we're actually going to do that. So I've set up a new variable, stmt for statement, equals MySQL. Don't forget that MySQL, that is the variable that has got all of the login credentials, all of the connection credentials for username and password, etc., that we've set up right at the beginning, up here. Here it is, MySQLi, what we set up right at the beginning of this exercise. Let me come back down. Okay. And then it uses, so it's using the MySQLi extensions to prepare on SQL. Now SQL, that is the variable that we set up earlier. I'm just going to go back and find it to show you. It's this one here. So it was this one, SQL, insert into master account, account number, title, first name, other names, last name, email, date of birth, gender, address, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me just scroll. County, postcode, mailable. And then do you remember the values were all question marks, yet to be assigned? Well, this is part of creating a prepare statement. So this is what we're going to do now, is we're actually going to fill in those question marks. And we're going to do that, if I come across and I find it again. Okay, here. We are going to bind the parameters. Yeah. So this next line here, dollar statement, we're going to bind parameters of SQL, of $SQL, as follows. And these characters replace the question marks. So the first thing, which is the account number, is an integer. So that's an I. And the rest of the fields are going to be filled with strings. Remember, they are, there's one date field for date of birth, which is a string, and the others were all variable character fields, all again strings. So all of those question marks change to an S for string. And those are the parameters that we're going to bind to this. That then is followed by the actual content that we're going to populate those fields with. So this is where we take our final account number variable array, we take the final title, final first name, final other names. These are all of the variables that we just went through in the previous section. And then finally we're going to do one last check before we write this into the database. We're going to do a last check to make sure that it is a legal insert, where we're going to say if final account number does not equal 0 and ACC check here does not equal I. Now remember that we had, let me just quickly go and find it. We go up, okay, here it is. So in the little bit of the cleansing and sanitizing we did, where we wanted to check if the account already existed, if it did already exist, remember we changed ACC check to I. Hence, that makes it illegal. It means we can't actually use it. So, come back down. So if final account number does not equal 0, and if ACC check does not equal I, then you know what? We can execute that prepared statement and we can insert it. And here it is. We've got $stmt statement followed by execute. And that is the little bit of code that actually writes that record into the database. If that doesn't work for any reason, it could be the case that you might have entered the wrong credentials, you might have used the wrong username or the wrong database password, or there is a problem with any of the content you're trying to put in. Maybe you're trying to put, I don't know, a string into an integer field or something. You will then get else ERR++, and don't forget that ERR we've got here, we've set it up once so that we can record the number of errors. Finally down here we've got the increment for $I, and then it goes right back up to the top to go right through this while loop again until $I is no longer less than final account number, in which case it stored all of those records into the database. Down here I've got end time for microtime, so don't forget the microtime is being used to time how long this code is taken to process. and then I've just output to screen. I actually say that elapsed a new variable, a new string variable, equals end time minus start time, and so this will actually work out how long that script has taken to process, and yeah, we've just got an echo output which is going to tell me that on screen how long it took to do. So what we've done is we started off with our CSV file in Excel with those 4 records. We've used PHP to open and import the content of that CSV file. We've sanitized it. We've gone through the process of, we've checked that it is a valid account number. We've reformatted the postcode into a correct post office format. We've changed strings such as title into the correct format, leading with an uppercase, with the remainder being lowercase, and we've gone through all that process, and now we've actually used a prepared statement to actually write it into the database. So now that I've actually shown you how we've done that, I'm actually going to just go back. We're going to take another look at the actual database, which is currently empty. We're going to run this code, we're going to run this PHP file, and we're now going to see it import into that MySQL database. Okay, so this is the database table that we were looking at earlier, the master account. So we've got all the fields there, the account number, the title, first name, right through to the last one, which is the mailable field. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the PHP code that we just created, and we're going to run that and let that actually import the contents of the CSV file. Okay, so here it is. So it was tossed import new customers.php. I'm just going to run that. Okay, it's done. So I added some visual cues to the code just so that I could see what was going on, and you can see here that it was reading the CSV file and cleaning and formatting content. So that was all the sanitizing that we did. Starting the MySQL insert here, and then the total records in CSV were 6 and the total records inserted were 5. Now remember that the first row of that CSV file were the field names in the header, and we didn't want that to be imported into the database, so that's why obviously we've actually only got 5 being inserted. And I actually went through that as we did the PHP coding earlier on. The execution time here was for 1 second. Of course, that's completely meaningless. I mean, this is just for 5 records, but that gets really, really useful. It could be 5 records today, and tomorrow it could be 500,000 records. That's why, as I said, I build in the elegance and I build in these checks and balances right from the ground up to make the code as scalable as it possibly can be. Okay, so let's go and take a look at that database. So now, if I browse, all of the contents of the CSV should be in there. So let's have a look. Yay, there they are. Okay. So here we have got our 5 records. We've got our account numbers, our titles, our first names, our other names, our last names, emails, DOB, gender, address, right through to the last mailable flag there, and they're all Y, so all of these people are mailable. So that's a success. Excellent. So the one thing that I want to try doing now is I want to try and trigger an error, just so you can see how the steps that we took when we were sanitizing and cleaning the data actually deal with that. In essence, it should make, if we put an error in a record, it should make it non-mailable. So let's see if we can do that. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to delete all of the contents here of the database. I want this clean again so we can rerun that script. Okay, cool. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back into the code here. Actually, no, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back into the CSV file. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to change a postcode. I'm going to take, let's take Rebecca Salter here. on row 5, and I'm going to change her postcode, and I'm going to change that 6, SA6 to SA asterisk 2QW. I'm going to resave that file there. Now what that should do is that should invalidate Rebecca Salter's record. So let's see what happens when we now run the script again. Let's run that PHP code. Here we go. Okay, it's run it. Let's have a look what's happened. So if I browse, so there you go. So we've got the same 5 records in here, but here we go. Rebecca Salter is at the end here. Let's see what happens if we scroll over. Yes, it's worked. So you can see her postcode is now invalid, and her mailable flag has changed to an N. So we know that all of that coding that I did for cleaning up and sanitizing that data works as planned. Excellent. Okay guys, so that is video 1 complete. So that has given us all of our sample records, all of our customers that we are now going to use to move forward into the next stage, which is moving toward that personalized e-zine that we're going to be sending out. The next video is going to be dealing with how we take the sales ledger, the sales records of our customers, and how can we actually use that to begin to personalize the e-zine. Don't forget, I'm only using the term personalization and personalized sort of for this beginning section. As I said earlier, when we get to the position where we actually have a customized e-zine to send out, at that point that will become the blank canvas from which we'll move forward, and then we'll start looking at how we develop the personal relationship, and that's when I'm going to leave the personalized word behind. I'm no longer going to talk about personalization at that point. One other thing I just wanted to say is that I mean, obviously I'm building these steps very much as if I were running a store. In many ways, there are hundreds of ways that you can skin a cat, as it were. So I think that if you are quite experienced in coding for PHP, you might come up with different solutions to the problems that I have to get to the same results, and that's absolutely fine. Your standard of PHP, I mean, again, it's really, we're looking at intermediate. This isn't really for beginners, but I hope that you're picking things up and it's helping you as I go along. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to the next video. Thanks a lot.